A spot of fishing. How about a spot of fishing today? Asked Mr. Brown at breakfast one morning. Mr. Brown's query was greeted in various ways by the other members of the family. Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird exchanged anxious glances. Jonathan and Judy let out whoops of delight, while Paddington nearly fell off his seat with excitement. "What are we going to fish for?" asked Mrs. Brown, hoping her husband might suggest something safe near the seashore. "Mackerel," said Mr. Brown vaguely. "Or we might even try for some sardines. Anyway, all those in favor raised their right hand." Mr. Brown looked pleased at the response to his idea. "That's 4-2 in favor," he said. "It's 2-all," said Mrs. Bird sternly. "Bears who raise both their paws at the same time are disqualified." "Well, I haven't voted yet," said Mr. Brown, putting up his own hand, "so that's still 3-2. There's a nice little island just outside the bay," he continued. "We can sail out there and make it our base." "Did you say sail out there, Henry?" asked Mrs. Brown nervously. "That's right," said Mr. Brown. "I met Admiral Grundy just before breakfast, and he's invited us out for the day." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird began to look even less enthusiastic at Mr. Brown's last remark, and even Paddington's whiskers drooped noticeably into his roll in marmalade. Admiral Grundy was a retired English naval officer who lived in a house called the Crow's Nest on the cliffs just outside the village. The Browns had met him on 1 or 2 occasions, and he had a voice like a rusty foghorn, which always made them rather nervous. The first time he had bellowed at them so loudly from the top of the cliff that Mrs. Brown had been quite worried in case there was a fall of rock, and Paddington had dropped an ice cream cone into the sea in his fright. "Been watching you for the last 3 days through me telescope," he'd roared at Mr. Brown. "Knew by your shorts you must be English. Thought I saw a bear gallivanting about on the beach. Couldn't believe me eyes." "I think his bark's worse than his bite," said Mr. Brown. "And he seems very keen on our going out with him. I don't suppose he sees many English people now he's retired." Said Mrs. Bird mysteriously. "I can see we've got some preparations to make." And with that, she left the table and disappeared upstairs, only to return a few minutes later, armed with a small parcel which she handed to Paddington. "Something told me we might be going sailing," she said. "Seawater makes bear's fur sticky, so I made a sea-going outfit before we left out of one of Jonathan's old cycling capes." Paddington gasped with astonishment when he untied the parcel and saw what was inside, and everyone stood round admiring while he donned a pair of oilskin leggings, a jacket, and a sou'wester. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Bird," he said gratefully, as he made some final adjustments to his braces. "That settles it," said Mr. Brown. "We shall simply have to go sailing now." After they had collected their belongings, the Browns made their way down the winding cobbled street leading to the harbor, and Paddington followed them in a daze. To have one surprise was a nice way to start any day, but to be told he was going sailing and to have a new outfit at the same time was doubly exciting. Paddington was very keen on boats and harbors, and he liked the one at St. Castile in particular, for it was quite different from anything he had ever seen before in his travels. For one thing, the fishermen used most unusual light blue nets, which looked very jolly when they were hung out to dry. And even the men themselves were different, for instead of wearing dark blue jerseys and rubber boots like most fishermen, they had red jackets and wooden clogs called sabots. Paddington had spent a lot of his time sitting on the quayside with the Browns watching the activities in the harbor as the sardine boats came and went, and he was looking forward to the day's outing. Admiral Grundy was already on board his yacht when the Browns arrived, and as they rounded the corner, he gave a start and then fixed Paddington with a steely look from beneath his bushy eyebrows. "Shiver me timbers!" he exploded. "What's this? Expecting a gale?" "Shiver your timbers, Mr. Grundy!" exclaimed Paddington with interest. He peered hard at the Admiral's boat, but it appeared to be all in one piece, and the planks seemed well stuck together. "I think he's surprised at your oilskins," whispered Judy, as the Admiral looked up at the sun and then back at Paddington. "My oilskins?" said Paddington hotly, giving the Admiral a hard stare back. "They're some of Mrs. Bird's specials." Recovering himself, the Admiral held out his hand gallantly to Mrs. Bird. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he exclaimed. "Hope I haven't offended you. Come along now. Women and bears first."